Everybody, welcome back. So we finished our first little mini 2-week section of the course, which means it's time for a new lecture. You'll recall in the last lecture, I spent a lot of time talking about the sectional crisis of the 1850s, right? This series of events that lead up to the Civil War, the Mexican-American War in the 1840s. The enormous controversies that war causes, including bringing so much territory into the Union and deciding whether or not that territory is going to be slave or free. The Compromise of 1850, which is an attempt to deal with that issue. We talked about some of the consequences of that act of Congress, including the passage of a Fugitive Slave Act, which means that federal marshals are going into northern communities throughout the 1850s. They're hunting for escaped enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, and then bringing them back south. We talked about 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, another attempt to address this issue. Will Western territories be slave or free? The Kansas-Nebraska Act is really an attempt by the Democratic Party, who's in control, to kind of push the issue onto voters. And what we see after that law is pro-slavery and pro-abolition partisans flooding into Western territories, into Kansas, and waging war on one another, murdering one another, trying to create governments that can then create constitutions that are pro or anti-slavery. We talked about the Dred Scott Act, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, right? One of the most consequential decisions by the United States Supreme Court in American history, which in essence says any ban on property ownership is unconstitutional, which means all bans on slavery are unconstitutional, which means that slavery could theoretically exist anywhere in the United States, not just in the southern slave states. And then we talked about the intensification of anti-Southern, anti-slavery feeling in the North after that decision. And we talked about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. So it's a tumultuous decade, and it leads up to a presidential election in 1860. And this is going to be the thing. I guess the cliche might be the final straw. This is the final straw. Okay. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the election of 1860 here, and then I'm going to move in to thinking about how these two sections sort of formed themselves in the spring of 1861, how they began to mobilize for war, what the relative advantages were going into the war, and then we're going to leave it there. Okay, so you'll remember the Republican Party is a new party. It's formed in 1854. It's a direct response to that Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Whig Party dissolves over that very law. The Republicans are exclusively Northern. They are dedicated to the ideal of free labor. They're ardently anti-slavery. There's an abolitionist wing of the Republican Party who would argue they need to go into the South and actually destroy slavery where it is. There's also just an anti-slavery wing of the party that says it just can't expand any further, right? We need to contain it. We need to make sure it never comes north. We need to protect North America for free white men, essentially is what they're arguing. The Democrats, meanwhile, they're barely holding on throughout the 1850s to their national coalition. The Democrats continue to be a party of the North and South, but it's increasingly difficult to keep that together. So let's start with them. The Democrats hold their convention. Parties in the 19th century, in the 1850s and 1860s, of course, but throughout the century, they held conventions just like parties do today. And the Democrats hold their nominating convention in a very odd choice. They choose the city of Charleston, South Carolina. Let's think about Manisha Sinha's piece about revolution or counter-revolution and just how important that city was in the world of antebellum America. Charleston, it's a small city now, but it was really the intellectual hub, the political base of secession. Um, it was the home of John C. Calhoun, who we talked a little bit about, who had developed the sort of theories of nullification or popularized the theories of nullification and brought them to the South, that Southern states had a right to nullify any law of the federal government and that they could leave whenever they wanted to. Um, so the Democrats make the choice to go to the very heartland uh, of secession for their convention. Um, this is odd because their goal is to save the Union, essentially. At least members of the party are concerned about saving the Union. Um, and so maybe to some extent they choose Charleston as a way to try and calm down or show the most ardent secessionists that they care about their interests, that they want to support them, um, and to try and bring them back into the party fold. I don't know. Their leading candidate was Stephen Douglas. Let's see him. There he is. He's on the top left. He's called the Little Giant. Stephen Douglas is probably the single most important politician in America in the 1850s. He's from Illinois. He's a senator. He's the designer. He's the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He's by far the most important person in the Democratic Party. And so it seems obvious that he's going to be the nominee. But Douglas was a Northerner, and he was not the pro-slavery visionary that Democrats were going to need to have to hold the whole party together anymore. In fact, it wasn't really going to be possible to hold the party together anymore. The Dred Scott decision, which said that slavery had to be upheld everywhere, essentially demolished Douglas's key idea of popular sovereignty. Right? Douglas says, the people of any territory or state can say if they want slavery or not. Dred Scott says that's not true. Dred Scott says it's a constitutional guarantee that every white person, has a right to own slaves if they can afford them. So Douglas's key idea, his key contribution to politics, is no longer legitimate. Southern Democrats, for their part, they call for an explicit constitutional amendment that guarantees slavery everywhere in the territories. In other words, they want to put that Dred Scott decision into the Constitution for good, right? The rest of the party doesn't agree with that. The Democrats of the two major parties are the more comfortable with slavery from a Northern perspective, right? Northern Democrats are less likely to be anti-slavery, but they're not going to get behind a constitutional amendment that guarantees slavery in Western territories. That would be the end of them forever, right? They'd have to go home to people in Illinois and Michigan and Ohio and New Jersey and say, oh yeah, you will now have to compete with enslaved labor if you ever decide to move west. It's just not going to work. And so when they resist that, Southern Democrats storm out of the convention. And that is essentially the end of the Democratic Party as it had existed throughout the antebellum period. Okay, so just like the Whigs had dissolved, the Democrats now split. And they split into a northern faction, which is called the National Democrats, and a southern faction, the Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats, they end up nominating Douglas, of course. He's the leader of the party. The Southern Democrats nominate a man named John C. Breckinridge. Breckinridge was actually the vice president of the United States. He is the vice president under James Buchanan, which again is just a reminder. Secessionists were not, they did not exist on the fringes of American society. They were among the most powerful people in American society in the antebellum period. The leader of the sort of secession party in this election, going to this party, or at least the most pro-slavery party of them all, was the vice president of the United States. And then Breckinridge would go on to be Secretary of War in the Confederate government. That's a spoiler alert. He didn't win the election. So by June of 1860, the Democrats now have two parties for the presidency. Let's talk about the Republicans. The Republicans have their convention in the West. It's a symbolic choice. They meet in Chicago. Um, and it's symbolic because so much of Republican ideology is about the West. The West, the land, is the birthright of white American men. And slavery threatens that birthright. That's such a really important part of Republican ideology to keep in mind. Going into the convention, the party's leading figure was probably William Seward, senator from New York. We read Seward on the irrepressible conflict. Seward was a very outspoken figure in politics in the 1850s, and he was closer to the abolitionist wing of the party than other candidates were. And so even though he's probably the most prominent figure in the Republican Party, he's a little bit untouchable because nominating an abolitionist is seen as too volatile. Essentially, it says it would be the Republican Party saying our policy is to go into the South and destroy slavery. And they don't want to do that. They know that that would sort of be kicking a hornet's nest. Abraham Lincoln is also a candidate, and he's fairly unknown. Okay, Lincoln had been in the House of Representatives in the 1840s. He served one term, so 2 years in Congress. He was not reelected. He had been sort of in the wilderness of Illinois politics for much of the time since. In 1858, he ran an election for Senate. He challenged Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas shows up everywhere in the politics of the 1850s. He's everywhere. So Lincoln ran against him. This is one of the most famous elections in American history, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates about slavery, about the role of the Constitution in American life, about the future of the West, etc. He loses, but he did, from that election, sort of build some national name recognition. So even though he's got kind of a limited record, he also seems like a safer option. Lincoln was born in a border state, Kentucky. He knew slavery from that experience. He had encountered slavery. He was not terribly connected to the abolitionist movement. Again, fairly unknown figure living out in Illinois. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, came from a family of slaveholders who still owned slaves. So his in-laws were slaveholders. Despite all of that, Lincoln's record was actually pretty clear, right? So on the surface, he seems like the safer candidate because he's not as vehement. He's not as close to abolitionism. But actually, he was very open as a strong opponent of slavery, as someone who had said that slavery was not only a threat to white access to the land, but was actually a moral evil. And as we read this past week, he believed slavery was not what the founders had in mind. That slavery was not part of the American experiment. It was an accident, in other words, and it had to go. He would often say, we don't blame Southerners for the accident. We're all to blame. But we all have to share that blame and get rid of this problem. So he was a supposedly safe option, but again, a strong anti-slavery candidate for the presidency, and that's who the Republicans end up nominating. That's 3 candidates. The fourth candidate, there is a fourth candidate. There's only a few major elections in American history with 4 major candidates. The other big one that you might hear of, there's the 1824 election, which is sort of the 4 major, I'm not going to go into the 1820s politics, but 1824 and 1912. So those are other major 4-party elections. And what that means is that, among other things, parties are going through a state of realignment. That the 2 major parties don't necessarily have the control or power over the political process that they might in other moments. People are fracturing. and there's room enough in the electorate to support 4 candidates. So the 4th candidate in 1860 is a man named John Bell. He's a senator from Tennessee, and he's running under a new party called the Constitutional Union Party. And this is kind of slapped together. It's like old Whigs. It's slaveholders who are deeply concerned about disunion, and those people are the ones who live in the Upper South. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Um, it's anti-immigrant voters who don't feel like they have a home in the Republican Party at this point anymore. So that means they're very anti-Catholic. They're deeply concerned about Irish immigration. So that's who the Constitutional Union Party is. And there's a lot of people. This is one of the best sort of non-major party showings in an American election in the history of the country. So let's go to the election. Okay. We've got 4 candidates, each representing a different large faction of the electorate. Lincoln was not on the ballot in any in 10 southern states, in almost any slave state. He was on the ballot in some slave states. But in 10 southern states, he was simply not on the ballot at all. He wins all northern states except for New Jersey, where he still won a portion of the electoral votes, but not all of them. Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat, he wins all the slave states except for Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. Again, those are either border states or Upper South states. And I'll talk about that in a second, what was going on there. John Bell, the constitutional unionist, wins Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and then Douglas only wins one state, Missouri, and he wins a few of the votes in New Jersey. 60% of the voters in this election did not vote for Lincoln. Let's take a look at where he did well. So the deeper the red here is where Lincoln won. So he's obviously a northern candidate. He picks up a few votes in some border states, and in Kentucky and in Missouri, you can see him picking up a few votes. There are even parts of Virginia where he's able to pick up a couple of votes. Parts of Maryland and Delaware, those are slave states where he's able to pick up some votes. But his support really comes, obviously, from the North, from throughout the North. Again, that's only about 40% of the total vote. And then here we have Breckinridge. Again, you can see the further south you go, the darker green you get, and that means the more support Breckinridge had. You look at the state of South Carolina. South Carolina did not vote, did not have popular voting for the presidency. We talked a bit a couple weeks ago about how South Carolina was a counter-revolutionary state. It was traditional. It was deeply, deeply conservative, and how they chose their president was the state legislature selected electors, and those electors chose. So it was average citizens did not vote for the president in 1860 in South Carolina. Here's John Bell, and John Bell has significant support, as you can see, and predominantly that support was coming in the Upper South. He did get support, though, all through the North, or at least through most of the North, not much in New York, but he's in New England, he's in Pennsylvania, he's in Ohio, and he has some significant support even in the Deep South, right? You see significant support for Bell in parts of Florida, Alabama, significant support in Georgia, North Carolina. North Carolina is a state that is sort of on the fence about this whole secession thing. So what you see there, I mean, is there is support for a unionist candidate, right? Hold the union together, stop the flow, stop the power of secession. Let's not rush into this. Let's find a compromise. And then the very pitiful showing of the Democratic Party. There's just not much faith, as you can see, in the traditional, the national Democratic Party anymore. There's going to be no support in the South, right? Because all of those votes are for Breckinridge. And so Stephen Douglas, the most prominent politician of the entire 1850s, has this sort of pitiful showing. Those people have either voted for Republicans or they voted for Bell, or in the South, they voted for Breckinridge, of course. Lincoln, again, 60% of voters do not vote for him, but he has the plurality, and he wins the election. In response, secession. December 20th, 1860, several weeks after Lincoln's election, South Carolina unanimously votes to secede from the Union. They declare themselves the Palmetto Republic. Palmetto is the symbol. The palmetto tree is the symbol of South Carolina. And then they reach out to other states and encourage them to join. Okay, and that starts to come after the new year. So now we're into January of 1861, and things start to progress fairly quickly. Mississippi secedes next, and then Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. That's all within about 3 weeks in January. So you're at February 1st, 1861, and you have the 7 states of the Deep South have seceded, and they've begun convening their new government, the Confederate States of America, and they've appointed Jefferson Davis of Mississippi as their president. Okay, I just want to clarify something. In the 20th century and in the 21st century, since the 1930s, the United States has inaugurated its new presidents in January, right? So this year, or next, we're going to elect somebody in November, and then in January, that person will be inaugurated. In the 19th century, inaugurations were in March, right? So what I'm saying is these 7 states had seceded, and James Buchanan was still the president. Abraham Lincoln had not assumed office when the 7 states of the Deep South had seceded. It was not any single thing that he had done as the executive, right? Because he was not the executive. It was rather the promise of him becoming president that spikes the secession movement, that sparks the secession movement. Let's think about this for a second, which states are seceding, right? You'll notice a moment ago when I was saying which states seceded, South Carolina, which we have right here. And then second was what? Mississippi, right here. And then we go Florida, Alabama. What was next? Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas, right? That's that deep south stretch. It's the furthest south states. What this map suggests is that these states were also the places with the highest proportion of enslaved people in the population. The deep red spots are where the most enslaved people were. By the way, just very quick aside, you can see where enslaved people lived in the 1790s and then in the 1860s. This map is pretty profound, showing the growth of slavery, just how far west it went and how much more of these deep red spots there were, just how many more enslaved people there were. Remember, about a little more than 4 million enslaved people in 1860. Okay, you'll also notice upper South states, border South states, had not seceded in March when Lincoln was inaugurated, right? Tennessee, over here, North Carolina, Virginia, and Arkansas. Those states are eventually going to secede. They haven't yet. And look, they have smaller populations of enslaved people, or they also have large sections of the state with low slave populations. So Virginia has this vast area to the west with a very low enslaved population that can balance out slaveholders in legislature for a little while and kind of stem the tide of secession, at least through most of the spring. What's going to happen during the war is that part of the state's actually going to secede from Virginia and join the United States. It's going to be called West Virginia. Okay? That's where that state comes from. So the other thing you're seeing here in these upper South states is not only lower slave population, there's deeper economic ties. Um, there's a general fear of war, right? Where is the war going to happen if there is a war over secession? It's going to happen in the upper South. It's where it's going to be nasty, because that's where these two sections meet each other. And then there's also a sort of general faith in the Union, right? If we go back just a few slides and we look at how John Bell did in the election, look at the deepest color for Bell is in upper South border states, right? That suggests to us that there were people in those counties who wanted the Union to persevere, and they were willing to vote for someone who would make that happen. Okay, so what we have in the spring of 1861 then is we have this initial wave of secession, we have a Republican president coming to office, and we've got this sort of bubble, right? The border states, the upper South states, what are they going to do? What's going to happen? The secession leaders, right, the states that have seceded have a plan for this. Okay, and what they do is they form what they call commissions, essentially teams of lobbyists, and they send them out to slave states that have not seceded to convince them, right? Go to the state capitals, talk to the people, write in the newspapers, write op-eds and say, this is why you should secede. This is what you should do. I'll talk about these guys for a second, these secession commissioners. There's been some confusion in the last 150 years about what the heck what actually caused the Civil War. A lot of people have said, well, it was obviously slavery. But others have rejected that, and we still see this a lot in our politics today. They say, it's not actually slavery, that it was about something else. It was about states' rights to self-determination, something like that. What historians do when they encounter a conflict like this this is why historians matter, right? This is what we can do. We go back and we find the original sources. And we find out, what did people actually say, right? I know that somebody in the 21st century is saying it was about slavery, and another person in the 21st century is saying it was about states' rights. But what did people in 1860 say? Right? What was their perspective? And nobody is a better source for this than these secession commissioners, right? Who else would we turn to explain secession than the people whose job it was to sell secession? How did they sell it? What was their angle? Okay, what did they actually say? How did they convince Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, or one another, right? The other deep South states, Georgia, Louisiana, how did they convince them to take this crazy, enormous leap and leave the United States to break the Constitution? It's an amazing moment. I've got some evidence from them I'd like to share with you. Here's William Harris. He's a commissioner from Mississippi, and he's sent to Georgia to convince Georgians to secede. Okay, Northerners, he claimed, have demanded and now demand equality between the white and Negro races under our Constitution. Equality in representation, equality in the right of suffrage, equality in the social circle, equality in the rights of matrimony. The Republicans, he wrote, or he said, would bring freedom to the slave, but eternal degradation for you and for us. This line, he says, equality in the rights of matrimony. When you read the secession commissioner's writing, you will be struck by how concerned they are with sex. They speak almost unanimously about the idea that Republican rule will mean that black men will have sexual control over white women. that white men will lose control over white women. So this is a gender power issue, and it's a race power issue. Okay, this comes up all the time. And it comes up all the time in 19th century politics more generally as well. This is, if you look at the antebellum North, criticisms of abolitionists will often come back to this issue as well, right? One of the sort of foundational ideas of racism in the United States generally, but particularly in the 19th century, is the need for white men to have dominion over white women's sexuality. In fact, to have dominion over all sexuality, including black women's sexuality, but particularly to protect white womanhood from the idea of like black violation, is how they would put it. And the secession commissioners know that, and they bring it with them to these legislatures. That's what they're talking about on the eve of the Civil War. Here's a couple others. Isham Garrett and Robert Hardy Smith from Alabama. And they're also going to Georgia. And they argue that banning slavery in the territories is going to destroy the value of slave property in the Old South. The white children, they say, are now born who will be compelled to flee from the land of their birth, or to submit to the degradation of being reduced to an equality with slaves, or formerly enslaved people, and all of its attendant horrors, right? If the Republican Party comes to power and we do not secede, we will have to live equally with our own slaves. Henry Benning, a Georgian commissioner to Virginia, puts it like this: we will be completely exterminated, and the land will be left in the possession of blacks, and then it will go back to a wilderness and become another Africa. Okay, so why did the South secede? The answer is to preserve slavery, to preserve white supremacy, to maintain absolute control over black people and their labor, and to resist any movement towards equality. Other issues mattered. I'm not going to say other issues didn't matter. Tariffs mattered in 19th century politics. They mattered a lot. But tariffs were always an issue in 19th century politics. They're an issue in the 1820s, and they're an issue in the 1880s, and they're an issue in the 1930s, and they're an issue right now. Tariffs don't spark secession. They don't even really contribute to it. They don't lead these governments to break, a decades-old bond, deep political and economic relationships. What Henry Benning here was talking about could, though, right? This is fear. This is terror. This is racism. These are more deeply seated emotional feelings, and these are the sorts of things that could spark secession. There's another side to this as well, which is a sort of a Southern nationalist vision, a belief that not only are we afraid of losing slavery, but like Manisha Sinha said, right, these people view slavery as a positive good, and it needs to be expanded. And so why even bother with a northern section that doesn't have slaves? Why not just create a totally slave-holding republic that continues to expand, that expands out west, that expands to Cuba, that expands into Central America, maybe expands down into South America? So those are the sorts of things that they're thinking about. But when secession commissioners want to convince somebody that they're right, this is the button that they push. This is the racial fear is the button that they're going to push, and that's going to tip the scales. All right. One last thing I'll say. States' rights mattered in the 19th century. They mattered a great deal. States' rights aren't nothing. So when people say that that's the cause of the war, it's not that they're wrong entirely. It's that they're being willfully obscure, and they're avoiding the more central issue, because at the end of the day, states' rights don't really mean anything outside of the context of the issue to which they're being employed, right? The question always has to be states' rights to do what? States' rights to do what? That's the thing that matters, right? And states' rights have been an issue at almost all times in American history, right? States' rights are the key issue in the women's suffrage movement. Do the states have a right to give women the right to vote? States' rights are a key issue in the North in the 1850s, the state's right to protect its own residents, including escaped slaves. And in modern American history, states' rights are an issue. States' rights to allow gay people to marry. States' rights to allow union members to collectively bargain. In 2020, states' rights to allow the sale of marijuana. These are all states' rights issues. These are, and it's very important. This is what federalism is. But again, it's the issue to which they are put, right? That's the thing that matters when we're talking about states' rights. It's the cause to which they're employed. And I'm not saying this because I'm a constitutional lawyer. I'm not saying states' rights only matter based on the cause. What I'm saying is this is politics, okay? People don't go to war. People don't risk literally everything for a constitutional principle like states' rights, okay? But people sacrifice a lot for things that mean much more to them than constitutional principles, right? They sacrifice a lot. And that's going to be the thing that's going to drive their decision making. The way people feel, the way people think deeply about an issue is the thing that matters at the end of the day. Okay. So those are the causes of secession. Let's think about this critical month in American history, April 1861. Lincoln's inaugurated in March. By April, 7 Confederate states have seceded. They formed a new government, as I said a moment ago. Its capital is in Montgomery, Alabama for now. Later on, I don't know if I'm going to mention this again this semester, so I just want to mention it now. Later on, that capital is going to move to Richmond, Virginia, which is the sort of industrial hub of Southern life. And it's also it's closer to Washington. It's closer to where the war is really being waged. But for now, it's in Montgomery, Alabama. And they begin seizing federal property. They seize courthouses. They seize post offices. They seize forts, including Fort Sumter, which is out in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. Lincoln has promised to hold on to remaining federal property. All right, he comes into power and he says, this is the thing we're going to do. We're going to make sure that no one's seizing our post offices. No one's seizing our forts. The Confederacy, though, has already seized it all. So Lincoln has a problem right off the bat. Should he try to make an effort to preserve that federal property and risk provoking the South or risk having to take the first shot and look like an aggressor? Or should he do nothing? And think about what would be the case if he did nothing. What would the consequence of that be? Right? If Lincoln chooses to say, okay, you can have the forts, you can have the post offices, in effect what he's doing is saying the secessionist government is a legitimate one, and he's renouncing the sovereignty of his own government of the United States of America over that territory. That's not ours anymore. It would be abdicating his own power to control that land. You're not going to find many rulers in world history who are going to do that. And even if he wanted to, he couldn't, because there's no way his electorate, his Republican supporters, even many of his Democratic supporters are going to accept that. He can't legitimate the secessionist government that way. So he's in a terrible bind right off the bat. What does he do? He hopes to buy time. Wait, right? Wait for something to develop. Wait for some break in the action that can help him make his decision about what he's supposed to do. Meanwhile, the Republican papers are pushing him, do something, act, Mr. President, please. I believe it's the New York Tribune says, do we have a government? Is there a government in this country or not? Because if we do, we should probably do something. So he takes the first step, and it's a very conservative one. In April, he sends a ship of supplies down to Fort Sumter with under the argument that he's only going to provide food and other basic provisions to the Americans who are on that island, Fort Sumter, and have been there since January. They're running out of supplies. There are weapons on the ship, but he says it's just a food and provision ship. The Confederate government, knowing this is happening, orders the fort to be evacuated and surrendered. The commander of the fort says no. So the Confederates say, we're going to begin a bombardment. It's all very gentlemanly in a sense, right? They're sending notes. We're going to start bombarding. It's going to be at this time, right? No one wants to risk killing anybody because that would mean that would be a step towards war that everyone's very afraid to make at this point. The Confederates begin their bombardment. It's April, I believe it's April 12th and 13th are the days of, April 12th and 13th, 35-hour bombardment of the fort. No one is killed, but these are the first shots of the American Civil War. The commander of the fort is forced to surrender. He asks for and is granted the right to give a 21-gun salute as the American flag is brought down at the fort, and this territory is handed over to this new Confederate government. During the 21-gun salute, a barrel of gunpowder explodes, and I believe it's two young soldiers are killed, and those are the first casualties of the American Civil War. It's an accident. But the most important consequence of Fort Sumter is that in its wake, the other 4 slave states that will secede do. Just 3 days later, Virginia secedes. What they say is, Lincoln was provoking. Lincoln was at fault by sending that ship there. He provoked the firing, and so he started it. We're seceding. This is a really important moment. If Virginia did not secede, there really wasn't going to be much of a war. Virginia, in addition to being the home of Richmond, which is, as I said a moment ago, an industrial powerhouse, home to a great deal of the wealth of the American South, and also home to Robert E. Lee, who's going to become the commanding general for the Confederate forces. Okay, so this is a critical moment, and Virginia votes to secede. Tennessee, North Carolina, and then last, Arkansas secede as well. Let me just make sure I have that order right. Yep. Secede as well. So by June, the Confederate states that are going to secede that's 11, and they've formed their final sort of coalition. The border states that never seceded are really in the thick of this. And this is like the heart of the Civil War is in these places: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. There's a cliche about the Civil War, that it was a war between brothers, right? And it's really true in these places. Here's a few examples. Families are split. Thousands of families are split. One brother on one side, one on another. Mary Todd Lincoln, First Lady of the United States, right? The wife of the Republican president. She's born in Kentucky. She has 4 brothers and 3 brothers-in-law, all of whom fight for the Confederacy. Henry Clay. I talked about Henry Clay last time when I was talking about the Compromise of 1850, one of the most important politicians of the 1820s and 1830s. Henry Clay has 3 grandsons who fight for the Union, and he has 4 who fight for the Confederacy. He's dead at this point, but his grandsons obviously are not. So this list of fractures it just goes on and on and on as people begin to split up, and this is really happening after Fort Sumter. Okay. Now we're going to, there's Fort Sumter, by the way, there's the bombardment. So we're going to read in Drew Faust's book how people felt in the midst, in the thick of war, right? How Americans adjusted themselves to mass death, extraordinary human atrocity, suffering, privation. Um, how youth would be shattered, idealism shattered, basic faith in in the human condition would be shattered during this war. But that was not the case in 1861. Okay, or at least not in the spring and into the summer of 1861. So I want to think about, well, what were people actually thinking about? What's really on the table here as the war is now becoming or starting to feel like something of an inevitability? In the North, there are feelings of pride. There are feelings, I guess you could say, of joy, even joy that the sectional crisis is sort of finally going to be resolved. We're going to figure this thing out one way or another. Um, there are great feelings of excitement. This is going to be a significant moment. People are ready for it. There's a widespread belief that the cause is just, that the cause is to save the Union. There's not a great number of people talking about abolishing slavery in the summer of 1861. Southern secession in this northern perspective is a threat to civilization itself. 19th century Americans thought about the Constitution a lot. They thought about it intimately, and they understood it as a sort of protection against against the wilderness, against the degradation of society. By seceding, the South had brought on the degradation of society and had to be stopped. There's a New Hampshire farmer writes this: "The question now is country or no country, liberty or slavery." Right? This is kind of, these are the sorts of things that people are writing into their newspapers. These are average people as they watch these events unfold. Save the Union, save the Constitution, save civilization. That's what they're thinking about. And Southerners are saying somewhat similar things, right? But they have a different vision of what civilization is. And they're arguing that this is a war for liberty. We're going to fight for our liberty. And here's what Lincoln later on says: everybody declared for liberty in 1861, right? Everybody says this is their cause. And liberty is, of course, an abstraction. It's a very powerful, it's a very intimate abstraction, but it is an abstraction. And in 1861, that's what people are talking about. They're talking about abstractions. We're going to fight for liberty, Constitution, right? Union. Maybe we'll get to have an adventure along the way. There's a lot of young men who are excited to have an adventure. But those purposes don't support a war effort. They certainly don't support the largest and most intensive war effort in the history of the hemisphere, right? If the war gets long, and it's going to get long, and if it gets difficult, and it's going to get difficult, some other purposes are going to have to emerge, right? They're going to have to figure out other ways of understanding why they're fighting. And the governments are going to have to figure out other ways to get people to fight. It's not going to be enough to tell them that they're going to fight for liberty. Okay. Americans had no clue how to mobilize for war on this scale. When we think about the American government today, we take for granted that we have a massive standing army, an extremely well-financed, an extremely highly trained military complex, right? 19th century United States did not have that. Okay, there's actually quite small military capacity, and mobilization becomes the real issue in these early in these early months. The other major issue is how are you going to pay? Okay. The United States government in the 19th century, especially before the Civil War, had very little in the way of public finance. There are tariffs, right, which is a tax on imported goods, and that's about it. There is no income tax in the antebellum United States. There aren't sales taxes, right? So how are you going to find the money for this? There's no real national debt apparatus, right? How do you find someone to finance this thing? These are all questions, and they're questions for both governments. How are the Confederates going to pay for this? How are they going to build up the industrial apparatus to support this thing? These are the things people are really concerned about. They're not thinking about necessarily the bloodshed, the loss of life. They're thinking sort of basic terms. How are we going to pull it off? Let's think about relative assets on each side. The North had far greater advantages at the beginning of this war. One is wealth, right? The North had 4 times the bank deposits of the South. I should note a good deal of the bank deposits in the North in a place like New York City were from Southerners, and many Southerners kept their bank deposits in the North because they thought it was more secure, and they were right? They held their capital in Northern banks to keep it safe throughout the war, including a lot of people from Richmond, the capital of Virginia. The northern states had 110,000 factories, and they had 1.2 million industrial workers. There were as many factories in the North, over 100,000, as there were factory workers in the entire South. 80% of American manufacturing capacity was in the North, 80%. New Haven, Connecticut, one city, had 10 times the firearm manufacturing capacity as the entire South. Right? American weapons came from the Connecticut River Valley, from Springfield, Massachusetts, down to New Haven, Connecticut. That's where the guns in this country came from. And the South did not have much in the way of manufacturing capacity for weapons. 80% of railroad miles were in the North. And the railroad miles that were in the North were uniform. They were laid the same. You could run a train from Chicago to New York. Railroad miles in the South were not uniform. It's a localist society. So you would have to change the train every few miles as you went from one county to another or from one state to another because the gauge of the tracks was going to be different. The vast majority of engineers and mechanics in the United States lived in the North. You name a material good in the North probably had an advantage. Ships, cloth, pig iron, wool. You name it, that's where the advantage was. And they had a lot more people. There were 22 million people living in the North in 1860. There were in the South 9 million white people, and there are 4.5 million black people. 4.2 million of them were enslaved. Okay. So the Confederate war effort can only pull from, at least the fighting force, can only pull from about half of its white population, not even quite that, right? It's going to pull from men, and it's going to pull from men of the appropriate age. The Confederate States can use enslaved labor as support for the war effort, of course, but not its fighting force. That would essentially delegitimize the entire purpose of the war. And then there's just one other really important point. The North didn't have to invent a government. It's really, really hard to build a government, to be a sort of revolutionary state and construct a new state, right? It takes time. It takes decades, as a matter of fact. And that was all there for the northern states to be exploited. And it certainly didn't have to invent a government based on localism and like the privileging of the idea of states' rights, right? Which is not going to be helpful when you want to fight a major war as a nation state. Did the South have no advantages? No. There were advantages on the part of the South. One thing is a geographic advantage. The South is massive. It has a massive coastline. It has very valuable, very navigable river systems. And there's a positional advantage that the South has. This is going to be a defensive war for them. They don't have to invade. They're not asking to topple the government of the United States. They're asking to create a new government out of land from the United States, right? And they're not asking, they're just doing it. Which means the Northern Army is going to have to come in and stop them. So they're going to be on the defensive. As long as they stay on the defensive, they're going to be in a position of some strength. They choose in 1863 to go onto the offensive and move into Pennsylvania, and we're going to talk about what happened there at Gettysburg. It doesn't go well. As long as they remain defensive, that's something of an advantage. They have a psychological advantage too. By that I mean they don't have to think about going off to a far land to defend Union and Constitution. They can stay where they are, more or less, and say we're defending home. And that's so much more intimate. That's so much more motivating than like law and the Constitution, right? They're defending home, and that's a psychological advantage. They don't have to think about defending the social order in the same way, right? They can instead they can think about their families. They can think about their where their homes are. So that's the thing I'm fighting for. What about slavery? So I talked about slavery just a second ago, but it's a complex question. Was that an advantage or not? You know, on the one hand, sort of. That's a lot of people that can be forced into labor for the Confederate Army, and they are. There are thousands of enslaved people working in Confederate camps. They're building transportation infrastructure. They're working in new factories. Most of that industrial output that the Confederacy manages to accomplish is going to be done by enslaved people over the next few years. Nurses and aides in Confederate hospitals are largely enslaved people. So that's something of an advantage. But I would say overall slavery is the Achilles heel of the Confederacy. Essentially what the Southern war effort is going to have to do is fight two wars, two fronts. One is going to be obviously against the Union, and that's going to be a continental front essentially. And the other is going to have to be against their own enslaved population, who's going to be pushing to try and escape and trying to thwart the Confederate effort at all times, right? It's roughly a third of the total population of the South stands to gain a lot from the Confederacy losing. That's a positional advantage. That's or disadvantage. That's a real disadvantage for the South. It's very vulnerable. Let's talk a little bit about just a couple last things to wrap up here. One, the Civil War is sort of a crossroads in military history, although the people who were living in 1860, 1861 probably didn't quite realize what this meant. On the one hand, this is going to be a 19th century war. It's going to be using tactics that are drawn from the Napoleonic Wars, right? Two armies line up on opposite sides of the field, and they approach, right? And they fire upon one another, and they try and destabilize one another's positions and claim territory, right? That's old school war making. On the other hand, though, this is going to be a modern fight. It's going to use technologies that Napoleon definitely did not use. The most important one of those is the rifled musket, right? A smoothbore musket that was an older technology. It could fire, or it could kill at about 100 yards. These new muskets, rifled muskets, where the Minet ball is going to spiral out, can kill someone at 300 yards. They can hit targets at 800 yards. It's just far, far deadlier technology. There's going to be guerrilla fighting out in the West in particular, guerrilla fighting in the state of Missouri. Um, and old weapons plus new tactics mean this is going to be a horrific struggle. No one quite recognizes this. Definitely no one recognizes this in the summer of 1861, but it's just going to get worse and worse and worse over the next 4 years. Let's talk about the draft. Where did soldiers come from? Both sides of the war were going to engage in conscription, but they don't do this right away. So in 1861, there's no drafted soldiers. But there will be drafts. The first one is going to be the Confederacy. They start drafting in April of 1862. That is actually the first draft in American history. And it's all able-bodied men 18 to 35. That later is raised to 45 were to be drafted, unless you owned more than 20 slaves. And again, this is, on one hand, that shows us the sort of class stratification of Southern society, but on the other hand, it reminds us that this is a two-front war for the Confederacy, and they need men at home to control and to prevent the enslaved population from completely upending Southern civilization. The Union conscription comes in 1863. This is the drafting of every able-bodied man 20 to 45 years old. You could get out of it if you're willing to pay $300, which suggests again to us the power of money in Northern society, the power of wealth, the power of the elite to sort of buy their way out of this. In the end, the Union really didn't rely on the draft. It was terribly disruptive. Political issue, leads to incredibly violent and horrific riots in New York City in 1863. But actually, the Union didn't really use drafted soldiers much. Only about 6% of soldiers in the Union Army were drafted, which suggests, among other things, either a real commitment to the cause of fighting this war or just enormous social pressure in small towns all across the North to go and join the effort. About 20% of Confederate soldiers were drafted, which again suggests the Confederacy needed to coerce people into this a little bit more, which is an interesting point. Okay. First major battle, last point I want to make here. So July 1861, Northern soldiers were not prepared. They were not trained really at all. They had never learned how to retreat, among other things. Lincoln is, as I was mentioning before about the Fort Sumter crisis, Lincoln was under a lot of pressure. Make a move, do something. So he says, let's just do this. Let's move on this growing Confederate camp about 20 miles outside of Washington. Observers, this is sort of a famous story, but observers flock down from Washington. They bring picnics and they're going to take it in. It's going to be a fun day watching the battle. At first, the Union forces seem to capture just a little bit of ground, but then a counterattack comes. It comes from a young Confederate general named Thomas Jackson, who gets a new nickname at this battle because he is so sturdy. He's like a stone wall. He can't be moved. Stonewall Jackson swings against Union forces, breaks them, sends the Union soldiers scattering back to Washington. It's a humiliating defeat. It's not a good sign of things to come. And it's a total disaster. In the wake of Bull Run, Lincoln decides to give command of this new army called the Army of the Potomac to George B. McClellan. He's a young general. He's an extremely vain general. He's an extremely narcissistic guy. And he's also extremely hesitant to move. And so after Bull Run, it's going to be another 9 months until McClellan gets the army moving. And we're going to leave it there. At that point, the war begins to spread to the west, but we'll pick all that up in our reading of Drew Faust and in the next lecture. Thanks a lot.